Test, test.
Test, test.
Little fire kids are in there, huh?
You guys want us to start? Are you? I'm ready. Okay.
Recording.
You're good, Alex? Okay. Yep. We are.
Okay. All right, we'd like to welcome everyone to the work session for the Planning Commission meeting, October 5th, 2022. We have just a couple of items to take care of today. Just to review the agenda, we have project CUP-22-011 and project ZTA-22-0003. So do you guys have a particular order that you want to?
We'll just go in order.
Okay, we have a quorum, and we have
Commissioner Evler is on.
Commissioner Edler. All right.
Yeah.
Terrific. All right.
I'm on.
We're gonna take one quick minute. Andy Holka took a new job, so he's no longer with the city. Samantha has been promoted to senior planner.
Congratulations. Wow.
Just a little bit of staffing change, and then we will hire a new associate planner.
Terrific.
Process of that right now.
Well, we're sorry to see Andy go.
We were too.
Yeah.
I genuinely cried. So
No.
a good opportunity. He'll still.
Oh, that's great.
We'll give him your best. Congrats.
That's true.
Thank you.
Okay, we will just run through the two agenda items. Neither of them on their own is that complex, but there's some backstory, as I'm sure you're aware from the packet on this first one here. So the first one is a wall height extension. It's a conditional use request. You'll remember at the last meeting, the commission voted to be the authority for this one rather than through the administrative hearing process, just due to previous appeals and kind of the whole procedure. So I'm going to go through that here. And tonight, staff's recommendation on this one for tonight, it's not clear in the packet, would be to just take public comment. If you're ready to close the public hearing, do so, and then we'll take it under advisement and come bring it back in 2 weeks as an action item. So this is, like I said, a request for a wall height extension, which is a process in our ordinance that allows residential properties to build fences or walls or combinations of both to heights greater than the normal 6 feet, which is just allowed by right in the side and rear yard of residential properties. I'll get into, there's another slide that just shows, the different requirements based on the height you're proposing. This is on Caldor Cove. I don't have a zoomed out context here, but this is over off of Union Park Avenue, over kind of across from Walmart and In-N-Out. There's a residential neighborhood by Milne Lane. So it's on a private road back in that area of the city. The summary here is approval to construct portions of a side yard fence up to 8 feet at its highest point. Some portions of this fence that is already built are 6 feet or less, so that part wouldn't need approval here, but there are portions that exceed 6 feet. The property slopes down from north to south, from front yard to backyard, so the fence line, the height gets taller, the top of the fence stays the same. The fence is already constructed. Staff has measured it and verified it does not exceed 8 feet, even at its highest point. This is imagery. This was in the packet, but this shows the fence as constructed. So you can see there at the front of the property, it's actually, even less than 6 feet tall. And then just on this picture on the right here, it tails off, dives down kind of to the back of the property there. Not very far, then there's a gate and kind of cast iron fencing down below. But this portion of the fence does exceed 6 feet in height. So that back portion is the subject of the review tonight. I'm not going to go over this too much more. We talked about this last time as we explained the context. There's quite a background of this application, though. It's fully detailed out in the staff report. From an original CUP hearing to withdrawal to construction and complaints and appeals and enforcement and all kinds of things that have led us to the most recently the appeal hearing officer ruling that even though the fence as constructed technically violates ordinance by not having a building permit, not having gone through the CUP for the 8-foot portion, the city is required to accept the application and process it. which is what we're doing now, which is what's in front of you tonight. Here's some relevant ordinance references that kind of are the basis for these requests. It's in the supplementary and qualifying chapter of the zoning ordinance. Basically, that ordinance allows fences up to varying heights, and it's fences and walls and combinations. So you can have a fence on top of a retaining wall. It's all measured the same way. It's considered one thing. Up to 6 feet is allowed just by right. No CUP, no building permit or anything is needed. You can just go build that. And I'm talking side and rear yards. Front yards are kind of different. Above 6 up to 8 is allowed with a conditional use permit and a building permit, which is what process we're in with this application here. And then above 8 and up to 12 is also allowed with all those previous requirements plus signed neighbor consent. That's not the case here, but that's just, those are all the options in the code. Fence is defined right in that section as a barrier of any material or combination of materials erected to enclose, screen, or separate areas. Staff's interpretation of what's built is that this encloses an area, it screens an area. So we've interpreted this as a fence. And then fence height, the way we measure fence height is basically the reference is there, but from at any point along the fence, you measure from the natural ground that the fence comes out of to the top of the fence. That's your fence height. Structures, when we measure houses or different structures, we take averages and do some different things. That's not the case with fences. It's just wherever the fence is, you just measure from the bottom to the top, and that's your height in any given area.
From the existing too.
Yeah, from natural grade, you can't raise the property up, artificially and then start your measurement from there. There are 2 required criteria for wall height extensions. They're listed there, but basically the existence of unique or special circumstances relating to the property would be substantially minimized or eliminated by the increased height. And that erection of such a fence or wall is the most reasonable solution under the circumstances. The rationale provided by the applicant in this case are listed there. There's 4 items that were in their narrative. There was some other rationale in the public comment that was submitted with some safety concerns and things like that. But an area for the family's pets to access the yard, to screen utilities, to mitigate noise, and to provide privacy. We went through, these are fairly common applications that come through the administrative hearing process. Just since 2019, I put approximately 10 in the staff report, but we counted it today. There were 15 wall height extensions that have been approved since 2019. Privacy alone is used as a rationale in almost, if not all of those applications, as a legitimate reason to approve these to satisfy those 2 findings. So there is some precedent here that privacy is a valid rationale. So when we get there, our recommendation, as is detailed in the staff report, is approval with conditions that a building permit be obtained. And where this is already built, we're asking or recommending that the building permit be submitted to the city within 30 days. So we can't just prolong, coming into full compliance. And that anything that the building department needs to see or inspect or anything like that, that they take the steps to make sure that we can look at those things. And then number 2, the fence shall not be enclosed with a roof and utilized as a structure. That's a different type of structure. It's subject to different setbacks. It's kind of a different thing at that point. It always has to comply with the definition of fence as found in the chapter that I referenced. That said, we are just recommending as staff that you take public comment on this, and then we'll come back in 2 weeks and take action then, but it's up to the commission. There were 2 written comments submitted, one by an adjacent neighbor and one by the applicant. Those were forwarded to you. And that's all I have for this. Are there any questions on this one?
I believe there was a reference to a structure also being built in the public comment from the neighbor. Was that confirmed that there was a structure that was built inside of the fence wall as well? I believe it was a dog run that they had referenced.
There's a concrete pad in there. I think reading through that public comment, they were interpreting this whole fence or wall as a structure that should be subject to building setbacks and, going by the definition and staff interprets that as a fence and not a structure, so.
Especially
what that
with
was.
the concrete pad inside it being low enough that it isn't counted as like a deck. If a deck or even paved concrete exceeds 18 inches, at that point you consider it. Or it has to meet setbacks, but if it's below that, we just kind of consider it flat work or almost landscaping elements, so. I think, yeah, the references to structures, I think are referring to the wall. That you see in this photo or what staff considers to be a wall.
So we don't have any precedent for approving patios and, things that are at ground level with that density.
That technically in the ordinance, when you're doing flat work like that on your property, in most cases, there might be some ordinances that apply. That's generally like landscaping that doesn't need to come through permitting process.
Yeah, we have precedent there. That's what's
okay.
being asked, just of allowing that as a landscaping element without. Building permit without.
Got it.
So you wouldn't interpret it as a dog run or a permanent structure.
Well, it's being used as a dog run, but we don't interpret this
As
as
an enclosed.
as an actual structure subject to building setbacks like we do. There was a big addition done to the home. That is clearly a structure per code that had to meet setbacks.
Or if the walled area were to be enclosed with a roof, like in the condition that we recommended, that it has to be left open, it can't be enclosed with a roof over there. That would kick it into requiring those setbacks, but there's precedent here for it's being treated the same as other walls have been treated in past projects, so. Sometimes people will come in after the fact and want to add like an awning or a cover, and then we say it has to meet setbacks at that point, but.
Any other questions on that one? Otherwise, I'll keep going. Okay. The next one's a zoning text amendment.
I had a quick
Oh, hi. Sorry, Jonathan.
No worries. I just didn't click fast enough. So I was looking at the 1976-050
Yep.
and I was trying to do just a quick research on the definition of front yard, and I just couldn't find it. But under that same section, it defined the maximum allowed fence height of a front yard fence is 4 feet. So I was curious if the front facing facade fell into that, or is there a setback requirement that defines it under the front yard?
The front yard is anything that would be within the minimum front yard setback,
That's what I thought.
which is, I think, 25 or 30 feet. The fence is well behind that line. So this whole thing is considered side yard.
Okay, that's what I figured. I just wanted to make sure.
Appreciate it. Okay, I'll keep going. The next item in front of the commission tonight is a city initiated amendment to the mixed use ordinance. This modification was requested by the city council. And the direction we were given was that they would like to see a vertical mixed use required in the mixed use zone. And more particularly, they want to see ground floor retail in mixed use projects, more strictly required than we've seen using the code as it is today. I do want to note that the general plan update we're working on does include a component of completely overhauling the mixed use ordinance to a more form-based code kind of concept where, depending on where you are in the city, the standards are going to change a little bit. So this will in a way be an interim amendment that will serve the city until we get to the end of the general plan process and adopt that new mixed use ordinance. The existing ordinance, these are just snippets out of it, but the portions pertinent to defining what mixed use is, and you can kind of see as I read through this, the current ordinance kind of loosely suggests or requires mixed use, but I think the council just wants this tightened up a little bit. So right now the ordinance says a mixed use building is a single building containing more than one type of land use, or a single development of more than one building in use where the different types of uses are in close proximity. So that would be what we call horizontal mixed use instead of vertical. Planned as a unified complementary whole and functionally integrated to the use of shared vehicular and pedestrian access. And then interestingly, the ordinance says, here's an example of residential mixed use, and it just has this picture, but it doesn't say this is required. It's just, here's an example. Some examples that have been of developments that have been constructed using the mixed use ordinance today. Both projects on Fort Union. And it's labeled here as first floor office space. Those are live work areas, and they're not mandatory commercial areas. They can and probably are being used much more as residential than mixed use. And I think this is part of the concern is we want to see that ground level retail, and we want to require it a little bit stricter. We have examples of, this is actually an example of both horizontal mixed use and vertical mixed use with no residential at all. But the Cubes storage building on 1300 East actually has a little print shop that's a separate business on the ground floor there, Minuteman Press. So that's technically a vertical mixed use building. There's no residential there. But then as part of that, the veterinary hospital is also located in the mixed use zone. And when this was all built, that was all their own separately now. It's not one development by any means, but this was allowed as kind of horizontal mixed use buildings in the same area, being commercial. And then another recent one, the credit union on Union Park Avenue there, right at the entrance to the city, is technically a mixed use property. And the rationale there is it's integrated enough with the corporate center there to be considered horizontal mixed use. Now, what we're recommending doesn't necessarily dissuade future applications from looking like this. They will affect most strongly these residential products. So this is what we're recommending, just in the definition of mixed use, right underneath the one I just read. We're proposing to add this language here. First, commercial requirements, and basically saying commercial uses are required for any development or redevelopment projects approved under this section. Commercial or retail uses shall occupy a minimum of 70% of the width of the ground floor of buildings along the project street frontage with a minimum depth of 40 feet. And if a project comprises multiple parcels, you just do a kind of a net total there, and 70% of that ground floor area would have to be commercial. Anything above it can be commercial, it can be residential, it can be anything else, but the ground floor, it's a ground floor commercial minimum here. And then we've added a little bit stricter language for live work units. We are saying and recommending, hey, they're still allowed, but they have to meet the following requirements. One, that they have to provide direct access to the primary street frontage or parking area of a development. Excluding private garage space, the entire ground floor of the unit must be designed, constructed, and used as commercial space. So this is not a flex space that could be used as commercial. This says it has to be used as commercial, which the way we would require that is it would be required to hold a business license in that space. And then we get into kind of the one more use restriction, the commercial spaces within the live work unit that are used to satisfy the minimum commercial frontage, which would be your 70% 40-foot depth. If you have an area of that ground floor that's parking or storage for the residential uses above, that doesn't count towards that calculation. The live work unit's first story must be a minimum of 12 feet in height measured from the finished floor elevation. Commissioner Allen sent an email on this that brought up a good point, and we'll clean this up, but the intent is that would be to the ceiling. We want those commercial grade kind of floor heights in that ground floor area. And then parking provided for the live work unit must meet both the residential and commercial requirements of this chapter. So if it's an office, it's going to, whatever size that ground floor area is, will be subject to office parking standards.
I
Yeah.
have a question on that one. Do we require a certain ceiling height in other commercial properties?
I don't believe so.
No. No.
I think the idea there is that it keeps it functioning as a commercial space instead of having maybe the lower ceilings more typical to residential.
Yeah, and we found some language in a few different ordinances that they all kind of had this where I think Murray dealt with this. I don't know if it's in their current ordinance, but there's always a lot of pushback on the mandate for ground floor retail. Everyone just wants to put residential there. But the intention here on mixed use is you want that commercial activity on the ground floor, the bigger ceilings, the presence on the street, it all help the form of that.
Okay.
What's height restriction in mixed use currently?
It's 35 feet, and then conditionally, the planning commission can approve a third story.
Okay. Does that include podium as well, or?
It would, yes. Now, usually, this is gonna apply just in the mixed use zone. Usually where we see larger scale redevelopments, it's gonna be probably like a planned development district ordinance application where there's mixed use requirements there, but the height can be increased and you can get a little more flexible. Where I think this will apply most, if we even see it used between now and the time we get a new ordinance, would be the little redevelopment properties, probably along the Fort Union corridor, like we've seen on 1700 East and Brook Hill Drive.
One of the things that gave us some heartburn with both of those was that they were billed as. Yeah, it's gonna be commercial on the main floor, and when said the they is the developer. What the community prefers is something that looks more like Holiday, where it's like you can put shops on the main floor, but to do that requires a little bit of a heavier lift for the developer, which those 12-foot ceilings benefit the community and benefit the potential tenant. They do not benefit the developer. So that's. I like how you phrased it. I'm curious about the 70%. Is that? Can we go stronger than that, or what?
70% was
You can, yeah, we
what
saw,
Murray had done in theirs. They've recently done like a Murray mixed use downtown district that we looked at kind of different form from the product that came out of different ordinances. We liked the looks of Murray's. I don't think there's anything that says you couldn't do more, but
70 is a lot, and it allows for breaks for things like entrances to structured parking and things like that. If you go too much, then you may have some functionality issues.
Got it. So in this as well, you had referenced Holiday. That was an RDA project, so I think there's a lot of incentive for the developer to do that.
For sure.
With something like this, I have worry that even if you're requiring this, it's going to sit vacant because the amount of rent they're going to be having, similar to what's happened in Murray, 80% of those are just sitting vacant for years and years and years. So is there any type of density, any type of incentive that we can give the developers to, if they do go, let's say 80% or 90%, they can then have either more density or more height?
Well, I think kind of built into the ordinance, that you can request height to the planning commission as a conditional use, and the commission could look at, hey, they're going the extra distance to provide more commercial here, and they're asking for an extra story on top. Density in mixed use or in mixed use areas is 35 units to the acre, just permitted. It's not a conditional consideration or anything, which on these little kind of one-off development pieces, usually your parking standards or setbacks or landscaping or something else is going to limit your density more than the ordinance does.
Yeah.
So there are tools built in there to allow extra height, to allow a pretty high permitted density. And then in the planned development district areas, kind of your larger redevelopment pieces that really that PDD ordinance is more viable in a just, a hillside plaza or a gravel pit or a Highland Fort Union, a major node like that. They're going to use that anyways. And there are kind of trade-offs and benefits built into that ordinance that allow developers to do much more. But in exchange, they have to provide certain things that, mixed use wouldn't require.
And I'm just curious if there's any incentive to keep the rents for the commercial low, because we don't want just a whole bunch of vacant units on the base of any type of residential structure. And that's what I've seen in a lot of other communities without those types of incentives. So
yeah, I would say I wouldn't recommend pushing too far on incentives in the mixed use zone, because when you get to that level, we want people to utilize the PDD, because that's where the council's involved, and there's a lot more, the city can have much more of a seat at the table on those ones.
Cool.
But there is enough here where, you could justify, maybe an extra story or other things.
You could also, I don't know what Shane would say about this, but in the existing language that allows for the planning commission to award an extra story, I don't know if there's a way to add like a consideration for awarding that as being, X percentage of commercial provided. That, like Mike was saying, is already something they can award, but I'm not sure if it would allay your concerns to sort of like tie that to going down the trail. Or if that's even considered legal to do it in ordinance, but that would be one option you could look into.
I'm more so curious just because 70 seems like a lot for that amount of room. And if you want more live work, where Fort Union was more of the live work space, I mean, 70 seems adequate, but if it's a completely standalone commercial spot.
Yeah.
You know, it's just hard to be able to.
That, yeah, like, and like I said, that's where if you have a big redevelopment site, that's,
Absolutely.
we're gonna push, you know, prospective developers to use that other redevelopment tool, because it is built for those bigger sites. That tool is not built for these little corridors, and what we found is the mixed use ordinance isn't really well equipped for those sites either.
So what's the precedent on the 70% versus maybe a 30 or a 50 with that?
It's just research, and the council's directive that they want to see ground floor commercial.
Perfect.
So Sean, it sounds like you're really concerned about occupancy rates for commercial in Cottonwood Heights.
Yeah, I think the majority of that is just looking at what's happened in Mill Creek and Murray, and you had brought up Holiday, and Holiday had a lot of incentives based on those types of developments, but when you have a lot of these mixed use developments that are residential and commercial, the developer is going to charge very, very heavy amounts just to meet that compliance. So it's just kind of dead space. And that's what I've seen historically, especially for some of those non-community node spaces. So that requirement, just making it so that it's feasible for businesses to go in there and making sure that the offset. So if you have, let's just say, less percentage of need, the developer might be able to make a more affordable unit for commercial spaces versus maybe a higher in a space. Just because, once again, looking at the community and looking at some of the requirements in other communities as well. So
Probably,
You had a comment.
No, I was just thinking through that if we go less than 70%, though, that kind of defeats the whole purpose of ensuring that ground level is retail. I mean, I hear what you're saying, but what would be in the other? I mean, the walkways to parking and that kind of thing, but what else would be there if it's not retail or access to? What, I mean,
you could have like this is a little gray area, but like a leasing office for for units above, or even a unit that extends down and is ground leveled, something like that.
probably,
Yeah.
probably a matter of trying to kind of strike the balance between wanting it to be like a feasible fit to attract great businesses and also wanting it to actually have a ground floor presence as commercial and not have like sort of a token commercial thing like in a corner that sort of like feels like an afterthought. And it is what we've noticed as planners is when that happens, you tend to have people not even acknowledging that it's commercial. Or it reads residential from like the street and you're kind of not invited in as a pedestrian, knowing that it's commercial. So it's probably striking that balance of at what point does this meet the intent without having an unintended consequence of empty storefronts. And that.
So when the places on Fort Union were looked at, because it was before my time on the planning commission, was it looked at that there had to be the appropriate amount of public parking spaces in line with it being retail, in addition to having enough parking for the residential? Is that a
There was a requirement for a few extra spaces there, but where there's no mandate in the ordinance today that live work units have to be used as commercial. It's just flex space. And I think what we're seeing is the reality is they're just more living space.
Yeah.
There was discussion and hope that was going to have a Main Street feel that with the Fort Union master plan, that we were going to have something that was walkable with businesses that were accessible from the Main Street. The realities are, I don't think we're going to get a single one out of that, either one of those projects, like multiple units. I don't think there will be one. And live work these days, people that are working from home, then there's a ton of that going on.
Sure.
But the idea that people are working from home and having a storefront, that's seems.
I'll clarify also, this may be helpful. The 70%, the commercial requirement is for buildings along the project street frontage. So if you have a building in the back or something like that, that's, maybe doesn't have good access or good visibility, that doesn't apply. It has to meet the rest of the mixed use ordinance. And that could be something the commission explores. I think it's valid for that provision for a third story. to only be allowed when a building does meet this vertical mixed use requirement. And if it's maybe a building in the back that doesn't have street frontage, usually we want the massing on the street anyways, right? So if the building's in the back and it's just a residential building, maybe that third story shouldn't be eligible on that one. It should be only meant for those vertical mixed use buildings, because that's something we could do there.
Yeah, I think that'd be interesting just because, once again, the unintended consequences of requiring this is it's just dead space and we want to activate the community. And I think that that's where, as we're creating ordinances and, proposed ordinances like this, if you start looking at these developers pro formas, they're just going to have dead space, and it's an unfortunate consequence, but I want to be very conscious of that when we're looking
And
at
just
these.
charge an exorbitant rent for it to compensate for the cost to.
Well, they have to, from a bank standpoint, from a lending
To
standpoint.
recoup the cost to construct. them.
Exactly. So if you're requiring 70%, they're going to have to meet, let's just say, market rate for residential, which is, as we all know, very, very high. So if we could potentially look at some type of either affordability, application where either you take 70% of the width of the ground level, or 30% of your units need to be at 50% AMI or something like that. Where you either get really, really good commercial components to it, or you get another thing that's within our crisis of housing affordability and get a really good AMI in the building. So kind of give or take on that. Just because, once again, it comes down to economics for them, and I don't want a whole bunch of vacant commercial
Sure.
space in our.
Yeah, I think it's good to think about how these things would work in practice, and again, just trying to balance the product we want to see and then the feasibility of filling the space, so.
I get nervous about us adding another story just based on the public feedback that we got for both of those developments, and frankly, recent interactions with our current city council about wanting another ordinance to protect viewscapes. We got absolutely, we had people practically in tears talking about how adding, just even the stories that were going to be there, that, people look down into residential areas that existed, and some of those may be just specific to one geographic area, but as we look, when we start going vertically, I think let's be cautious about how.
So the third story is allowed today
Yeah,
with any building in mixed use. Doesn't have to be, it can be all residential, as you know, because that's what was
or
approved.
the additional, I shouldn't say third, but an additional story
Yeah.
as an incentive.
No, so what I was recommending is actually more restrictive than the ordinance today, is that provision that allows a third story conditionally, that's there today, only be allowed if the building is on the street frontage and is vertical mixed use.
Got it.
If it's a residential building in the back, it is just 35 feet, 2 stories.
And then just tying the award of that third story maybe to the provision of giving that percentage, I think.
I think Sean makes a really good valid point that we want to make sure that we don't end up with dead space. So,
Yeah.
I mean, if there's market analysis to see if there are communities that are successfully creating this Main Street feel, that are, adjacent communities, and I mean, we've just talked about a couple of them, but if there are best practices for how ordinance is written beyond the ones we've talked about already, that we're not capitalizing on, I do think from a character standpoint, we've got a lot of upside geographically compared to Murray, for example. But we're not Park City, we're not Deer Valley, so are we going to be able to expect that our occupancy rates will stay high? We don't want developers to be upside down necessarily.
Is there anything that we could do from the standpoint of density instead of height? So, for example, it's the 35 feet, but let's go, maybe 40 units to the
I
acre.
think it's.
So we could, but. Go ahead.
You want to do every other word?
Yeah.
And we can just like read each other's minds. I'll say what I was gonna say, and then if it's the same thing, great. Just gonna say, I think it may be less meaningful, given that density is already restricted by the setbacks that would be required there. So when you have the setbacks on the site already, you may kind of have that density cap, unless you were to also maybe change the way the setbacks are written. And with the larger sites where you could handle more density, I think that's where we want to see the PDD going in anyway.
But I think the majority of that is, of course, the setbacks, but if you're creating more thoughtful planning and architecture for that space, then it makes a project either feasible or not feasible, given you get more people, you also have that requirement. To be able to get the additional ground floor commercial
Yeah.
as well. So,
I mean, we can, there's no rush on this. The council directed us to prepare this with. I mean, this is the direction we got. It was about that long. It was one sentence in a work session. So we want to get it right, even though we think it'll be an interim kind of ordinance and make sure it's addressing things. One thing we didn't do was require all vertical mixed use, because what that would do is take, say this 1-story commercial building and then suddenly make it 2 stories. And I don't think that then incentivizes building height, which, as Commissioner Mills was saying, there's some concerns about that depending on where you are in the city. So this is just meant for, these residential projects we get that want to build all residential in mixed use zones. They have to come to the table and provide some commercial. If they want to go build a horizontal, an office and a retail site that are 1-story next to each other, that's still allowed under the proposed amendment. It's just when you have multiple stories, that ground floor has to be retail is the intent here. And as much as we need to workshop this, we're happy to do it.
Is that general idea though something that, you guys feel like is a good thing for the city? Maybe workshopping some of the metrics for how it's done, but what are your thoughts on just that general direction?
I personally am not a fan of increasing the density. I think we're gonna, I think we'd have to look at what that is. In terms of how much are we saying? Because I think there's a lot of concern with that as well, because then we're gonna start getting into a lot of traffic and parking issues if we're talking about increasing residential density. And that's a huge concern
It's a
for,
very big concern.
so I'm not saying no to it. I'm just saying that I think we have to just think about all the factors that go along with that. I'm fine with 70%, but also if there's opportunities to look at others that make sense, because the thought is that we want the majority plus to be retail commercial on the ground level.
Sure.
So if we go less than that, then that's defeating the purpose of.
And if you
Okay.
want to look at incentives, I would suggest your affordable housing approach is probably the most palatable one to take, because every city's, under pressure right now with that, and it's a big
Commissioner
deal.
Shuffle, do you have thoughts to add as well?
No, you asked opinions on this, and I definitely prefer a mixed use development to what we've got now, which is strip mall city and lots of
Yeah.
parking lots and a lot of pollution that comes from parking lot. So I like the direction of this, and I didn't mean to be critical. I mean, 12 feet in height just seemed a little bit arbitrary to the
Sure.
ceiling.
Yeah,
Partly because from a structural standpoint, depending on who's doing the engineering, that can create a soft story, et
Sure,
cetera, et
yeah.
cetera. But, the intent is something that I think is a really good fit for that corridor.
I think this is a testament to the good work that the commission does, that each of you has these different areas of expertise and can kind of share. Because we want an ordinance that functions well, and so that you guys could kind of bring up like, yes, this is a good thing, but how do we work through these specifics is helpful for us to know.
And I think it's interesting that you've gotten 4 different sets of problems and concerns.
Yeah.
And some of them conflicting with each other, which tells you that all
I have
this.
one more.
I mean, I think ultimately, if we're gonna try to add some kind of a Main Street feel, workshopping it.
Yeah.
In answer to your question, yes, workshopping it, I think, is a great idea. And whether the public interface is through the public comments, once we get it ready for prime time. And obviously it would hit the city council as well. I think this is a great jump off point. I think what you guys have done is great. And we definitely all have our individual concerns, and I think all of us are malleable enough that if we can make sure that the numbers pencil and that structurally it's safe and we could address the density concerns and that it doesn't look like the stuff that I think they're all things that can be worked through. I
The
think
dream
it's.
team.
Well, the dream team that doesn't completely agree on everything, but in a good way, so.
Yeah, well, I think this is good direction. Do you feel like this gives us kind of some stuff to look into moving forward, or are there other questions you want to ask?
Yeah, I mean, I would just. I want to know what provisions we need to go back and workshop. Is it the 70%? Is it the floor height? Is it, Is it exploring affordable housing incentives? Is it limiting extra stories and incentivizing vertical mixed use that way? Because we could take this 100 different approaches and come back, and if there's even general consensus on any concept. I'm hearing density, there's not, so I'm inclined to not mess with the density number, but we could tweak it in other ways to address some of the concerns.
Maybe.
So I was a really different take on this
Go
also,
ahead.
just to add a fifth. So
Sorry.
generally, I'm a huge fan of mixed use, but it also has to be appropriate in the appropriate places. I'm also a fan of density, especially within mixed use, because the commercial doesn't function without the residential component. And what you really want to do is get people out of cars and on their feet. And so there has to be the pedestrian orientation to these developments. So if they're just kind of like these onesie twosie things that are just dropped in places, it becomes hard, to have that as a kind of an overriding theme. One of the things I don't see here that has been explored in other kind of developments in mixed use areas is you, rather than encouraging, the car centric developments and whatnot, you encourage things like shared parking, where you reduce the spaces necessary for the actual development, so you can get increased density or whatever else as a trade. But this site would really have to have some pedestrian orientation to it, and it just really would depend on the site. But if you wanted another kind of tool in your in the ordinance, I would probably look at that as well. Because if you throw the typical parking standards on it, it becomes more complicated in terms of getting all the parking necessary for the commercial and the residential. So just that's the one thing I kind of noticed on here that wasn't.
Yeah, so shared parking is addressed. It's in a different chapter. It's the authority of the Architecture Commission.
Okay.
In the Gateway Overlay District chapter of the ordinance, they're allowed to approve
Reduce.
alternate or shared parking, modifications for that exact reason.
And I would say, Commissioner Ebler, that is something that is difficult to kind of force into Utah as it is now. I know I have a friend in Central Ninth that just hates those provisions because there is nowhere to park, and so it's just chaos. Right?
I get it, and that's why I'm like couching my comments with
Like, let's get us a nice little trolley through.
No, I mean, like best case scenario, and in the right places, that's what you do is you limit the parking and you get people out of the cars and whatever else. This is something where on a much larger development site, if it had better mixed modal connectivity, you could explore that. But when you live in a suburb or an exurb or whatnot, it just becomes incredibly more challenging. But it also just depends on what the direction and vision is. I mean, there's ways to create it. It's just not going to be done overnight. But I take your point, and it's well said.
Simon,
yeah.
Look at y'all night. I was curious if, from your perspective on kind of making it pencil as a project, would changing the 12-foot ceiling height do anything to make that more financially feasible, or is it really the percentage, like 70%, that is the crux piece for?
So I think there should be two ways of looking at it. I think we should look at the 70%, and then I think we should also look at the affordability factor. So it needs to benefit the community in one way, fashion, or form.
Sure.
And as Ebler had mentioned, if we have these isolated sites, let's just say in the middle of Fort Union, as any type of business owner, whether you're a small, coffee shop or farmers insurance, whoever that is, it's really difficult to be a destination on something like that, where having thoughtful, because you want the residents to benefit from it and you want the community to benefit from it. So I think if we were to do specifically with residential mixed use, some type of an ordinance where either it is the 70%, but the 70% needs to have some type of a space where it's incentivizing these spaces. Maybe there's a certain amount of units that require that 70%. So let's just say, 10 and above unit developments, would require that 70%. Anything below, we can get more units potentially, but either smaller units or micro units, and just get more affordability out of it. I don't necessarily know the answers to that, but I think there needs to be kind of two different routes that you look at it, because we don't want vacancy in commercial. And we want to benefit the community. So if we're benefiting the community, the best way to do that is to give more density, but just get more affordability out of that density. So, have deed restrictions in either the rentability or the for sale component as well. Or you are required to have mixed use development, or not mixed use, but commercial at 70% width. And, really push for that. But I think there should be either a minimum or a maximum size of project. And if somebody creates something on Fort Union, let's just say it's a 40 unit development, I think 70% is perfect.
Sure.
And that would create more of a space where it now creates an ecosystem for people that are living there to be able to now use the commercial spaces. But if it's a 10 unit development, let's maybe turn it into a 13 unit development. And those 3 additional units are deed restricted at 40% AMI or 30% AMI. So then you just get a little bit more density and they don't have to comply with that 70% ground floor. I'm thinking outside the box on this, but it just makes sense for us to kind of have 2 parallels on it where depending on size of development, because if somebody does come in and, they're able to accumulate enough land on Fort Union, we want to make sure that that is now activated from a retail component. But if it's just, 10 units, it's kind of hard to justify the amount of money that they need to spend for those units for that whole 70% to make it pencil, to make it so that the developer, is able to make the project happen and also be able to get somebody into that space as well.
Sure.
So I think we want to look at it in 2 different ways, truly.
And I think we can blend that really well, Sean. I mean, the idea, most residents want to see their favorite restaurant and 10 more just like it in Cottonwood Heights. Most of them feel guilty that we don't do a better job of providing affordable housing, but don't want high density. But, if we're close enough to the resorts, like having some options, that micro idea that we don't have, that the best option for our seasonal workers that are going to go work in the canyons is not to just stack it deep in the residential communities the way they are right now. And we give them some options that, we don't mind being in a really, really small apartment on top of your favorite restaurant. So, that I think adds a palatability for our residents that, when you ask about high density, we get the same response. No, generally speaking, only unless people feel sufficiently guilty, they're not interested. But that's a great blending idea. I think that's a great idea.
I think it could be interesting because I think mixed use is one of the best ways to transform a community, especially the gateways in the communities. And as long as we're doing it correctly, or, we have some type of an RDA space where there's additional incentives that could then.
Like in Holiday.
Exactly.
Your bigger sites will have that. So, this scale would usually be your little corridor.
Would it make sense for there to be, especially in the Fort Union area, an RDA zone or a CRA zone where we can incentivize on that?
Well, so the council has initiated 2, one at the gravel pit and one right down the street at Hillside Plaza. It's like a 40-acre project area. We don't have an RDA on the corridor yet. But that could be.
I know that some other cities have found success with that. Mill Creek, Salt Lake.
And RDAs now are very housing heavy. They're not fans of retail anymore. Jobs and housing is their big thing. So that limits a little bit wanting this retail corridor, but yeah, we are pursuing that in 2 sites and I'm sure once those are established, they'll want to look to others.
As another component to that, addressing the parking issue, we've got examples downtown that are just getting more and more locked up. The last major infusion that UTA got was around the Olympics. And I don't have any prognostication about the chances of us getting the Olympics in this state. But what I would say is that it would be really important for us to have in our pocket what we would love to see in terms of improvements in transit if there were new projects, and that will happen the moment that switch gets flipped. And just picturing, okay, well, what we would love is to have, whether it's a light rail spur, a trolley or whatever, coming up Fort Union, just in our minds, just purely hypothetical, what would that look like? I know that, the discussions, at least quiet discussions with members of the city council that, just imagining, okay, what could that be? Where would we put the people? How do we move the people? It's all these discussions all involve more vehicles on Fort Union Boulevard, and that makes all of us nervous because widening that road is not an option, and loading it with cars is getting scary fast, so.
But what we can do, probably not in 2 weeks, but at the November meeting is maybe come back with some options, some different approaches, and just have a menu of things and kind of hash it out and see where to go. I think I have a good sense of some of the concerns or requests here, so if that's an okay direction, we'll plan to do that.
Commissioner Evler, do you have any other, I mean, you came from a geographic area back east that had a lot of these density issues. If you have anything, I know that we're putting you on the spot here, but if you think of anything that might contribute to this discussion later on, just will you interface with staff if any other things occur to you? That you did some stuff on a much larger scale than what we're talking about.
Yeah, and we put when we did that, we put covenants in terms of the development, in terms of ties into traffic triggers and whatnot, and we put in mandatory circulator buses and whatnot that were good. But I heard some pretty good discussions just in terms of increasing the density, but then targeting those units for the 40% AMI. I think that's a fantastic idea that I would 100% support. And that, that kind of targeted thing where you're giving something to the developer, that's how you get, really good quality development and kind of solve problems and create win-wins. So, yeah, I mean, it's hard because you can't just drop, every development tool in a Cottonwood Heights context and say it's going to work. But I definitely have some ideas and I'll interface with staff. So,
Anything else?
No, thank you for the feedback.
Oh,
Appreciate it.
I will just note, we have 2 meetings this month, so we'll have this the first of the quarter. So we will have another meeting October 19th, so we'll send out, obviously, correspondence about the agenda, confirm your availability, but if you preliminarily just mark your calendars for that night, we get to hopefully see you twice. Fabulous.
Great, that's the end of the work session, unless I'll entertain a motion.
I have a quick question, Chair.
Please.
Do we have any kind of a timeline in terms of when the general plan is going to come back to us, or when we're looking at that?
Yeah, good question. We were directed, we got some guidance from the city council. We're now drafting. We have a draft of almost every chapter except for land use and kind of housing by association. We've got direction on that, so we're starting that draft now. Then the council, I believe, is going to take that draft out to 4 district-specific town hall meetings. And then we'll incorporate all that feedback, and then we'll start the formal process with the planning commission. So it'll be early 2023, I think, before you see it in that capacity.
Okay. Move to adjourn.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Yes.
Aye.
Okay, we are adjourned.
I let you down on the ARC meeting and get who second.